And we're live. Thank you for coming back for another episode. Hey, all you crazy sci fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. The podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So, without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Mr. Misha Burnett, introduce himself to our listeners and viewers.
Hi, I'm Misha Burnett, and I write weird short fiction. I like to think of myself as the spiritual descendant of people like Ray Bradbury and Harlan Ellison and Frederick Brown. I don't compare myself to them in their league, but that's the kind of spirit that I aim for.
And if
There's always
anybody's listening,
something.
say if anybody's
Sorry.
listening, I was gonna say if anyone's listening to this podcast, I have a special place in my heart for short content. So this is right up my alley. I wish it was more popular, but everyone's gotten so used to binging everything that the idea of just this one short little impactful story that hits you in the feels and then leaves you wanting more. I get it. So I really appreciate that you're keeping that alive for us.
Sometimes I feel like
So
I'm doing it single handedly, but I do what I can.
that's why I put out the anthologies with Bayonet books every year. We break even. It's not like we're making a lot of money. It's just I really do love short fiction. I'm kind of passionate about it. So you got to do what you can. Put your money where your mouth is. So the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we found them, and I actually was made aware of Misha through our mutual friend of the show, Declan Finn, and I made an offhand comment that we had several cancellations just with babysitting issues and it being summer and parents having kids. And he's like, "Oh, you want interviews? I can get you a dozen in a minute." And he posts one tweet and he tags like 100 billion people. And sure enough, August is booked. So thank you, Declan. But how did you become aware of the podcast? Was that when Declan tagged you and said, "Oh, look,"
Yeah,
or did you hear us
basically.
before?
It came up on my Twitter feed, and I'm like, oh yeah, I happen to have something that I want to promote right now, and if this guy will give me a place to talk, by all means, sign me up.
All right. But before we can get started on the interview, we do have this one gatekeeping situation we got to handle. So the religion question, sir: Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
None of the above.
Oh, do tell. What's your religion of choice?
Oh, I'd say my big three are Dick, Dish, and Delaney. Philip Dick,
Okay.
Thomas Dish, Samuel Delaney. If you're talking hard science, well, as hard as it gets, science fiction, I tend to go more towards the new wave. I like a lot of the cyberpunk writers, um,
Okay.
William Gibson, Walter John Williams, um, that Bruce Sterling. Bruce Sterling does some brilliant stuff. To be honest, I watched Star Trek when I was a kid, and I'm talking the original Star Trek because I'm an old man, but and I liked it. When I was 12 and 13. Um, the first Star Wars movie I thought was awesome, but it came out when I was 16, and I'm not a big fan of long drawn out, make it last forever kind of series. Um, Serenity was Firefly. Um, Here, this is going to get me excommunicated, but honestly, I think the best thing to happen to Firefly was that it got canceled. Can you imagine season 4 of Firefly? When Kaylee's a werewolf and who knows, Wash is switching body with Zoe, and no, it stayed good because it died young. That's my opinion. I think that if it lasted a full one full season would have been nice. Okay, but I think people romanticize it because it died so quickly, and it's easy to sit here and think, gee, it could have been great, it could have been this, it could have been that, but you know comparing that to what it probably would have actually become, I'm going to stick with my imagination. So,
there's
so
so
that's
much untapped potential with that canon and the lore they created.
Oh yeah. But see, and that's the thing, and that goes back to my love of short fiction, is that it throws, by ending so quickly, it throws everything on the audience. We get to imagine, the scene in the pilot when Anara has got the syringe. What was that? We never get to find out what that was all about. So we get to make up, and what we make up in our mind is probably a whole lot cooler than it really would have been.
Fair. This came out early aughts, so I'm not as familiar with what else was going on in TV back then on account of I was in college and busy. Um, but
I never saw it when it was broadcast. It was one of those things that years later somebody said, you've got to watch this, and loaned me their DVDs.
that's
So
how I found it. Yeah.
at the time that it was actually out, I had small children, and running around chasing them pretty much took all of my attention.
Absolutely, that I can relate to. All right, well, since we are polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, or the Wheel of Time?
Once again, I'd have to say none of the above.
Oh,
I did eventually get all the way through the Lord of the Rings. It took me 40 years between the time I first started to read it and the time that I finally dredged through it. Game of Thrones, Wheel of Time, don't know anything about. Now, if you want to talk fantasy, Tanith Lee's Tales of the Flat Earth, Michael Shea's Nift the Lean, Joe Clayton's got a couple of different series out, Moongather and Moonscatter and Skeen's Leap. I like fantasy. I just don't particularly like those, Ray Bradbury's The October Country, Something With This Way Comes. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. Just not much into the swords and armor kind of fantasy. I prefer the something's weird going on in what looks like the ordinary world kind of fantasy.
so what
Kind
they
of
would call
Melville.
so what they
Clive
would call
Barker. I'm sorry.
no, it's okay. There's sometimes a lag. We can't really help that. We do the best we can. So you're thinking along the lines of like the paranormal or the urban fantasy kind of deal?
Yeah, that's what it gets characterized. But what would you call something like Clive Barker's Weave World? It is unquestionably magic. It is unquestionably fantasy, but it's not Tolkien style fantasy. It's not
That's a good question.
pseudo medieval stuff.
That's a good question. I think at this point, urban fantasy or paranormal fantasy is sort of a catch-all for anything that's in the modern world, and we don't know what else to do with it.
Pretty much, yeah. Which
Because
is
I
where I do my work. That's me. I write stuff that's in the modern world that you don't know what else to do with.
see now that's going to make me want to do a podcast where we actually fireside chat where we dive into like paranormal and urban fantasy and stuff. Marking that on my calendar, and we'll keep going because that's a fascinating discussion. All right, so we here at the Blasters and Blades like both the fantastical and the scientific. But what was your first love, sci-fi or fantasy?
I'd have to say science fiction. Um, the first book that I can remember reading that really blew me away was Samuel Delaney's Nova. Um, that just it's so many. It's one that's not real well known, but it's magnificent space opera. It's this epic story about these two people locked in mortal combat and struggling to be the first one to get a load of radioactive material out of the heart of a supernova, an exploding star. And it works on pretty much every single level. And that's one of the books that made me decide I wanted to be a writer when I grew up. I mean,
Oh,
I read the more standard, the Heinlein, your Asimov, your Clark, all of that kind of stuff. There wasn't a lot of there wasn't the big explosion of fantasy until I was more of an adult. When I remember Sword of Shannara came out, but only Jim Rats read Sword of Shannara, and then Lord Foulsbane, and then the whole explosion, Raymond Feist, and then the D&D tie-ins with the Dragonlance stuff. But like I say, the fantasy that I like has always been the stuff that doesn't tend to get labeled as fantasy. It's more likely to get labeled as horror. But yeah, I'd say I started with science fiction. My mother had a huge collection of new wave, Philip Dick, Anthony Burgess, and people of that ilk that I read when I was way too young to understand what on earth was going on, and that had a big effect on me too. And also, I'd say poetry. Poetry has always been my first love. Whenever I list the authors who are most influential on me, Edna St. Vincent Millay, T.S. Eliot, Coleridge. Oh God, Coleridge is just so magnificent, and a lot of fantastic, paranormal, whatever you want to call it. You look at Byron, Keats, and Shelley, and how much of their stuff is would, if it was prose, be considered fantasy.
Okay, that's a deep answer, and I do enjoy that. So, what was your first memory of the speculative fiction as a genre? Was it, was it one specific property that you was your first experience with it?
Matthew Looney.
Okay.
Those were kids' books that my mother read to me, and actually The Hobbit. I said, it took me a long time to get through Lord of the Rings, but I loved The Hobbit. I remember my mother reading that to me, and it just absolutely blowing me away. So, um,
Did you watch the Hobbit cartoon that was made out in the early '80s?
that was the Ralph Bakshi one. I do remember seeing that, and of course, by then I was more into wizards and heavy traffic than that. But yeah, anything Bakshi did was awesome. Um, so yeah, I do remember seeing that. And Narnia, I remember I read the Narnia books. It was funny because I did not realize they were a series. And the first one I read was The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is still my favorite, although the Silver Chair is pretty awesome too. And just the idea of these invisible one-legged creatures bouncing around. I love that. The duffel pumps or whatever they were called.
So once you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, did it make you want to check behind your closets?
No. My closet was already inhabited by that point.
Okay, fair enough. So, all right, what is it like? So we talked about how you were introduced to speculative fiction, fantasy, and sci-fi and whatnot. But what is it about the umbrella that is speculative fiction that you love so much?
You get to lie and tell the truth at the same time. You get to talk about things that people don't talk about. And you get to say, hey, this isn't real. This is taking place on Mars, the and there's all kinds of things that fit under that umbrella, whether that's sexuality issues or racial issues or political issues or whatever. But the thing is you get because you've got that mask of unreality, you've got that distance that the fantastic element includes. In a lot of ways, you get to be more honest and more deep than you would if you were just telling an ordinary story. And I do a lot of that. I do a lot of, let's take something that concerns me and put a twist on it, and just and see, well, if we took this to the logical extreme, example is the one of the short stories that basically nobody is indifferent about is Ursula K. Le Guin's Those Who Walk Away from Umulus. People either love it or they hate it. But the thing is it took, okay, let's take the concept of the greatest good for the greatest number and test it to destruction by saying, okay, what if the one is just one individual? Does it still, hold true? And of course it doesn't. It's a lot of people have looked at it in a lot of different ways, but it takes that idea: is it okay to oppress a minority in order to get vast gains for everybody else? And I think it answers that question pretty soundly. That sort of thing. Delaney, of course, and dealt with a lot of sexual issues in ways by making them fantastic that you couldn't have done, in a non-fantastic kind of story.
Okay, so transitioning from what you love about the genre to the writing side of things. So what is it like? How did that experience go where you went from I love reading these things to I want to write my own versions of them? Like, where did that start for you?
I don't remember it ever not being there.
Oh, factory installed. Okay.
Yeah, pretty much as soon as I could hold a pencil, I was writing stories. And they were really awful stories because I was a kid and I didn't know anything. But yeah, I've always I can't ever remember not wanting to create. I did a lot of drawing as well. For a while, I was going to be a comic book artist because everybody was going to be a comic book artist. But then it turned out that I didn't have any talent in that direction. But yeah, pretty much I've never made because, and this goes back to something I was saying earlier about Firefly, is that I've always taken possession of the media that I love. Is that, I don't want you to make a sequel to whatever. I want to make it, I want to take your action figures into my backyard and tell my own stories. And every time I experienced a film or a TV show or a book that I really loved, whether or not I wrote it down, I wrote my own fan fiction, I guess you'd call it nowadays, of it in my head. It should have gone this way, or, this would have made a better story, or what if these guys, what if the Klingons met the Daleks, could could the Incredible Hulk punch out, somebody, the rock monster from Star Trek, and so it's always been part of the same process. I can't, if I like something, I will automatically start changing it in my head.
I do that too. When the story ends, I can always tell a story that was really well told, because when it ends, I keep the story going in my head, and often so you insert yourself into the world.
Right.
whether subconsciously or not. At first, I didn't realize I was doing it, but then I was like, oh, that's basically me. But yeah, that's how I started too. So many authors will let their own real world experiences influence the stories they tell. So were there any specific formidable moments that you think shaped the kind of storyteller you are?
Well, and this is something I talked about in my blog a little while ago, is that um, uh, my life experience very much. I tend to write about blue collar people because I'm a blue collar person. I dropped out of high school, bummed around, did a lot of other things. I've always worked with my hands. Right now, I'm working as a maintenance man for a senior apartment building, and that tends to be my characters. Is that I write about, I write what I know. I write about electricians and plumbers and carpenters who end up fighting monsters, or being chased by them or falling in love with them or whatever. Um, I've always figured that if you can't get a bazooka, the next best thing for a zombie apocalypse is a good pipe wrench, or a circular saw or something like that.
Okay.
So yeah, I definitely draw from my own work experience, which has been varied and occasionally hazardous, in writing my stories.
Well, as long as you have all your fingers and toes, you did a good job. All right. Well, it looks like one of them might have been missing. But so transitioning from the writing side, let's talk about things from a fan angle. So have you gotten any cool cosplay or fan art from your work yet?
No, no, and I think that's possibly because I tend to write. Nobody wants to dress up like a plumber, unless they're doing Super Mario. But I
Or
have
Ben
gotten
10?
some interesting interesting fan notes. My first, I before I started on short stories, I wrote a series of 4 novels called The Book of Lost Doors, and the main character in that story has got a demon living in his head that occasionally possesses his body and makes him do extraordinary things. But I got a guy that was writing me regularly who was talking about that he has a demon living in his head that is just like the one in this book. And it got kind of scary for a while there. I'm not sure whatever happened to him, but yeah, so cosplay, not exactly, but he was wanting to talk about, and I kept saying, look, this is made up, this isn't real, um, this is a fantasy story. But he's like, no, no, they're real. So I'm not sure what category that goes into.
Fair point. So has anyone ever asked for your autograph?
Not in person. People have asked for autographed books, and I will sign books. um, My signature is terrible. From a lifetime of having to sign work tickets, I just scrawl. The same reason doctors are bad at handwriting. If you're signing an invoice 16 times a day, your handwriting becomes just. But yeah, the other Kickstarters that um, I did with Kursova, they had autographed books as one of the premium things. And so yeah, I mean they're out there. There are books signed with my name on it. um, when I was working for the university, before I had this job, I donated my books to the university library, and they had me sign them all. So
So do you remember the first time a reader said, "Hey, I'd really like an autographed copy of this"?
yeah, yeah. Actually, it was a reader slash reviewer. I was sending her a review copy for a book blogging site, and I was about to, and she said, "You're going to sign that for me, right?" And I'm like, "Wow, yeah, sure." I never imagined somebody wanting my signature, but I mean, except on a check. But yeah, sure, I'll sign it for you. And that was kind of a, and when she got it, she posted a picture of it on her blog with, the open to the title page where I had scrawled my name on it. And she's like, "Wow, a signed book!" And I'm like, "Oh boy, I'm glad you're excited." I didn't think it was that big a deal, but okay. Um,
Well, it was a big deal for her. So,
it was a
so
big
what?
deal for her. Yeah.
What is the weirdest or funniest interaction you've had with a fan since you started writing? Was it the guy with the demon in the head?
Guy with the demon in the head. Yeah, that would be. Um, I've had people in my D&D group name D&D characters after my characters in my stories, and that's kind of cool. Um, but yeah, nothing really can match the guy writing me and telling me about the demon in his head.
So, what edition of D&D are you playing? Is it actually D&D, or is it that shorthand for some other system?
It's actually what is it's ACKS, Adventurer Conqueror King system, which
Okay.
is very similar to first edition D&D.
Okay.
3 die 6 in order. Um, it's brutal. It's a Sunday night game on Roll20, um, and we've been playing for about 3 years. I've probably gone through 20 characters in that time period. The very first game we played was a total party kill with the first random encounter in the dungeon. We just rolled up new characters and went back in it. It's very much towards the wargaming side of role playing gaming, uh, more like squad leader
Okay.
than any theater bit.
So, what's the longest you've kept a character alive?
Couple of months probably.
Okay. So,
We tend to we see all of us have relatively high stress jobs, and we tend to use the Sunday night game to blow off steam, and we do a lot of stupid shit. He is not a killer DM by any stretch of the imagination, but and he'll generally give us every opportunity not to do what we're about to do. And we're like, no, we could take it. We could take it. Sure, I'm a first level mage and I've already used my spell for the day, but I'm feeling lucky. Bring on the meth dragon. So,
oh my goodness, now I want to add a meth dragon to my campaign.
well, see, this campaign that we're playing in, we've been in a number of different places, but for a while we were in Chalt. I don't know if you've heard of that, but and here comes my cat. Do not walk on the keyboard, cat. But currently we're in Long, Florida. We're in a post-apocalyptic version of Florida, and so there are like meth versions of everything,
Because
that,
Florida.
yeah. Um,
So, any bath salt monsters? Because Florida.
we we have run across bath salts a couple of times as a dropped treasure item. Um, they can be traded to. There's a subclass of human beings called Florida men that the bath salts can be traded to Florida men for whatever they have, which is usually not much. Um,
Okay. So, this is the part of the interview where we ask you everything that you have read. So, can you give us the Reader's Digest version of your body of work?
yeah. Let's see. We've got a collection of science fiction short stories called Endless Summer, published by
Okay.
Kusova. We have this is actually out of print now. It's called Dual Visions. It's 5 short stories by me and 5 short stories by another author. The stories that were in here are going to be in my newest collection coming out. This I'm particularly proud of. Bad Dreams and Broken Hearts. It is a collection of stories all about the same character. That he's a cop in a world where magic works and is openly practiced. Basically, he arrests outlaw mages. The tagline is it's hard to fight wizards and demons when all you have is a gun and a badge. So I like to describe it as Dragnet with dragons. One thing that I did very deliberately is my main character in this does not have any magical abilities himself. He's just an ordinary cop. It's everybody else who's got magic. Dark Fantasies, which was put out by Baby Katie Media, who publishes Story Hack. These are all fantasy short stories. And I'd show you my novels, but I don't actually have copies of them.
Okay.
But I have collection of 4 novels, because when I first started writing, I thought novel series was the only way to do it. That probably qualifies as urban fantasy. They are based loosely on the Nova Express books by William S. Burroughs, without the cut up and the weird punctuation and all the other stuff that Burroughs does that makes it hard to read. But Cat Skinner's book, Cannibal Hearts, The Worms of Heaven, and Gingerbread Wolves are the names of those. And the more time that passes since I wrote them, the more that I see what's wrong with them. And those are actually the only ones that I've technically self-published. And I would love sometime to get them edited and redone and published with another publisher, but so far nobody's interested.
Okay.
And a whole bunch of other short stories. If you go to my Amazon page, it's like 5 pages long now, because everything that I've contributed a story to is listed. And I've done a lot of collections, a lot of magazines. Most of my stories, and that's the great thing about short stories, is when you sell them to somebody, the rights revert to you generally pretty quickly. And so then you can sell the story again in your own collection. So most of my stories have been collected in one collection or another.
Okay. Well, we're going to pause for a moment before we dive into the product that brought us here, and we're going to shamelessly shill for the man.
When a CDC quarantine fails, a Houston SWAT team is sent in to secure Ben Tom Hospital. What they find is destruction and death. Trapped in the building, cut off from the world, a mysterious voice on the radio is all they have to guide them to destroy a multiplying menace that can infect the world before the federal government enacts a final solution. Paul E. Cooley's The Black Outbreak is a standalone parallel story to both the 2015 Parsec Award-winning novel The Black and The Black Arrival, now available from Amazon.com in ebook and trade paperback. Podcast novel available at shadowpublications.com. We don't believe in happy endings.
All right, so no happy endings, but we're gonna try to be happy as we keep talking about the next part of this interview. So while all that you listed sounded fascinating, today we're going to talk about An Atlas of Bad Roads. You currently have this Kickstarter going, so this episode's going to air on Friday, August 5th, and you've got about a week-ish left at that point when you listen to this. But where did you get the premise for this collection? So, like, how did you come up with the idea for the theme that you have going on?
Well, some years ago, I decided I wanted to do short stories, and I wanted to do specifically, I set a goal for myself to do 3 collections. I wanted to do a collection of fantasy short stories, collection of science fiction short stories, and a collection of horror. And I've shown you the other two, and I'd show you the horror one if I'd gotten the proofs in time, but I didn't. And this is the horror collection. So I started. I tend to write short fiction with an eye for not just the current market, but also an eventual anthology or collection. And so once I had my science fiction and fantasy collections out, I started edging more towards writing horror. And so every time I wrote a story, I'd think, is this going to go in the next book? In addition to wherever else I was sending it. So once I started looking at it and I got the stories, there are 16 stories, some of which have been published before, some of which hadn't. And I started looking for an overall theme, something to call it. And I realized that I used a lot of different locations. I used a lot of, there's actually a fair amount of driving in the collection. And so I said, well, okay, this is going to be a guide to places you don't want to go. And so that's an Atlas of Bad Roads is the title I came up with.
So Rand McNally, except for you don't want to go to any of these places.
Yeah, pretty much. As a matter of fact, that's if you look at the Kickstarter, that's the concept that, yes, there we go. The concept that Kursova used for the cover is, and that's actually from a scan of one of my old map books, because I like map books. I don't like GPSs. I want the actual paper you get from the Laclede Gas Company sitting on the seat next to me. So yeah, that's the concept and kind of the overall conceit is, these are the places you'll go. And once we had that, then I was able to kind of put the stories together.
So, given your preference for not using GPS, do you ever laugh when you hear about people that have the dramatic incidents because they listen to the GPS tell them what common sense said? Hey, don't turn there. The sign says we're on one way, and it goes the other way. Yeah,
actually, I do. And for a while here in St. Louis, Highway 40, 6440, which is one of the major ways through the city, was shut down. And oh my God, people were like, I didn't know that, it routed me here. And then all of a sudden there's barricades in the way. And as a matter of fact, a while back, I was doing some work fixing shopping carts, actually. And I was driving a large box truck through rural Illinois. And I remember seeing, and somewhere I have a picture of a big sign on the side of the road that said, your GPS is wrong. Bridge ahead, 8-foot clearance. Because apparently people had just blithely driven on through and lost the top couple of feet of their truck.
There's a couple of places where there's bridges that routinely happens. And one of them, they even had to update like the signs. They lifted the bridge a little bit even to try, and people just still like ram into it. Is it a rail bridge that it happened at? Because that might be the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, it's got a reputation for that.
Yeah, apparently, like I say, they put up the sign, your GPS is wrong. I love that sign.
That's awesome. And they still don't listen because the accidents keep happening.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. As a matter of fact, in one of the stories in this collection, I have my character giving that opinion and saying that, if the satellites ever went down, that half of America would starve to death because they couldn't find the grocery store. I hope my
So
cat didn't do anything terrible.
no, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay.
So you mentioned that we've talked about a little bit about the story of the cover, but what came first, the concept or the cover? Like, was it,
Oh, the concept came first. Yeah. I when I pitched it to Alex, I said, an atlas of bad roads, and he's like, I know just the cover to do. And he also did the cover for Endless Summer, which that collection almost didn't have a title. We spent the longest time trying to figure out what the title of that one was going to be. But yeah, and he's got different. He's got an atlas-sized edition as one of the. Yeah, he's going to be doing it in the trade paperback, the regular trade paperback, and then the hardcover, and then the atlas size, which is going to be the same size as his magazine.
okay.
Just we looked actually into getting the spiral binding, but that's way too expensive. So it'll just be a standard binding, and then some of the little extras that we made for the Kickstarter are souvenirs that you would pick up at the various different places. We've got business cards, and we may not actually get into production with those if we don't make the stretch goals, but it was fun making them up.
So that sounds interesting. When sometimes we have people come to episodes like a year or two after we post them. If they're listening to this episode late and the Kickstarter closed, can they still buy the book on like Amazon or your website or somewhere?
Yeah, it'll be on Amazon. It'll be on Kursova's site. He's been going around with various different printers, and has got Tales of Woe. I think currently he's going on Hulu. Yeah,
I think
is the name of it. He was doing Ingram for a while, but they just don't like dealing with small presses, and which is sad because that's where the big business is nowadays. But yes, it will be available in perpetuity, all the different editions. Believe we're going to get an audiobook version. I have a regular reader who does my stuff, Brandon Casanelli. He's incredibly talented, and I believe I've already asked him about it, and I think Alex is gonna have him do the audio version, and then Kindle. If you still are one of the 5 people in America who has a Nook, you can probably get a Nook version.
So it's going to be wide?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to the book itself. So what would your 30-second elevator pitch for this collection be?
Blue collar weird tales.
Okay. That's direct and to the point. I like it. So what do you think makes your collection of short horror fiction special?
I think it's my perspective. I think it's I'm not an MFA graduate. I'm not a typical creative writing school writer. I don't write about college. Well, I used to work at a college, but I did maintenance there. And I think that makes my work more accessible in some ways. I think people can read my work and they're like, oh yeah, I know what it's like to get a call in the middle of the night and have to go into work. I know what it's like to, be in a situation where somebody calls you and they want to borrow your truck, or you're working the late night at a convenience store, or butcher behind the counter, and then your ex-girlfriend walks in and it's really awkward. That I try to meet people where they live, because I don't think the strategy of selling to rich people in Manhattan has really been doing good for the traditional publishers. I'm writing for Joe Blow. I'm writing for bus drivers. I'm writing for, people who work for a living and just want to relax at the end of the day, or they're on their lunch hour and they want to get away from things for a while, and a short story is good for that. Populace, common touch.
Okay, that's something. The everyman is something that that a lot of people can relate to. So that's not a bad strategy. So, other than horror, what genre or subgenres would you place this collection into?
Fantasy. There's a number of. I mean, I've got elves in it. They're not elves that you would want to spend time with. Um, I've got kind of a couple of them have got kind of a Lovecraftian feel. Um, I've got actually one of them. One of the ones that I'm most proud of is straight crime fiction. There's nothing supernatural or science fiction happening at all. It's just I actually wrote that story originally for Switchblade magazine, and they accepted it. I'm very happy about that. But yeah, most of them I would say are on the fantastic side rather than the I don't have any real. Well, I do have one time travel story in there that's pretty much science fiction. If time travel is science fiction. So yeah, I'd say more fantasy than anything else.
A good place to be. So you've already covered that these are all your stories. Do you ever do these Kickstarters where it's multiple authors, or do you prefer to work
Oh yeah,
with just
yeah,
your
yeah.
work?
No, I was in 3 of the planetary anthology stories, or the oh, what is that? Originally started by Superversive and then taken over by a different publisher, Tuscany Bay. They did a story anthology for every planet in the solar system, and the moon, which is not a planet, and the sun, which is also not a planet. And I was in 3 of those: Mercury, Mars, and Neptune, or Mercury, Venus, and Neptune. There's a series of books on magical schools that I've been in. I'll work for anybody. I really love short stories, and I really love working with different editors, working with different publishers, and working with different writers. So I always keep my eyes open for new collections. I've got a group on MeWe that is called Nasty, Brutish, and Short. That every time I find a call for stories, I post it there. Just kind of a clearinghouse.
Okay. So, do you, if we're looking at the collection as a whole, the Atlas of Bad Roads, what tropes do you feel like you use in these stories? I mean, I know it's going to be hard to narrow it down, so just because there's so many, each one's going to be a little different. But which tropes do you feel like you use the best or the most?
Well, once again, I'd say the working man who, during the course of his job, encounters something uncanny, inexplicable, frequently dangerous, and that's one that used to be a lot more prevalent, and that's one of my own personal pet peeves. Is not everything has to be personal. Not everything has to be, because your ex-wife is threatened, or because your children are threatened. Sometimes people do heroic things because it's their job, because they're in there just trying to get through the day, and all of a sudden the giant slime monster oozes out, and you got to deal with it. So so I do a lot of that. I do a lot of missed connections, missed turns. In the introduction that I wrote about this, I talked about getting lost is such a prevalent opening for horror movies, because it's a good analogy. You think you're going one place, and then you end up someplace entirely different. You think you're just driving to grandmother's house, but then all of a sudden you're in the middle of a cornfield being chased by giant scorpions or something. Hate it when that happens. So yeah, I'd say the central trope or theme is ordinary people who just are in the wrong place at the wrong time. Don't go looking for it. Don't deserve it. Don't this isn't some kind of karmic payback, or nobody's chosen. I don't have any chosen ones. I've just got some poor schmuck who's in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So, do these stories have a common like main character or secondary character that's throughout the stories, or are they all completely independent of each other?
These are all completely different, and they're not even in the same thematic universe. They not the same rules don't apply. So if you figure out what's going on in one story, that's not going to help you with the next one.
Okay.
These are all I start from scratch every time.
So you have 16 stories. Do you have, out of all those 16 main characters, a favorite?
Yeah. I think I'd probably have to go with Pete Ferris, who is the main character of the Blacklight Ballet, who's a civil engineer who is surveying an abandoned mall for a company that wants to buy it, and finds out that it's not quite as abandoned as he thought it was. But I like the way he handles the situation. I like the way that, and that's another thing. I tend to write very practical heroes. They don't necessarily accept that they're doomed. If he's going to work, he's going to check out this abandoned mall, and he's dressed for it. He's got steel-toed boots on. He's got his flashlight and his multi-tool and his leather gloves, and he's not easy prey. He's not easy picking. And he rescues the girl, and that's always nice. The bad guys have got a captive, and he figures out how to get her out of the cage that they've got her in, and gets her out of the mall entirely. And it's got as close to a happy ending as I ever get.
Okay. So, do you, with short stories, this is more of a broad question a little bit. When you write your short stories, do you tend to keep the cast small enough, or do you have enough room when you write yours that you could have a secondary character have enough space to be flushed out?
I tend to focus on one person, and just follow them through. There are exceptions. There's a story I recently finished that's not going to be in this collection, that is at the moment does not have a publication venue, but it's a story about a man who is sent to space station or an asteroid to grow food for Earth. Basically, he's bankrupt, and the bankruptcy court says, if you go volunteer to work this asteroid, we'll discharge your debts. And he gets there, and he finds out that the people who are already there are from a prison. They're all prisoner conscripts, and it's a women's prison. And so he's up there with 10 women, and I fleshed out those characters. I think I made them all individual people, but it's also a very long story. It's like 24,000 words, which is on the long end for short fiction. But that's kind of an exception, and that's kind of I wanted to play with the concept. Generally speaking, yeah, I tend to do one-man shows. A lot of the format is the old Twilight Zone, where it's just this guy, and this is what happens to this guy. And I think it's easier that way. Easier as a writer and easier as a reader.
Definitely want to have you back to talk about the prison story. That sounds interesting. And that's what's that, novelette or novella? I get those two mixed up.
I don't know what
I think it's a novelette at that size, but don't quote me on it. And if you know what it is, dear listener, put it in the comment section when we share this around the social medias. But when you wrote for this collection, since there are no secondary characters, is there a favorite bad guy that they face, or is it more like man versus nature is the bad guy?
Oh, yes. Favorite bad guy, actually it's a couple. Tam and Robin Lynn from The Silk of Yesterday's Gown. And and I never actually say what they are in the story. I do a lot of that. I do a lot of weird shit happens, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, but that is they're absolutely my favorite antagonists. The stories about a very wealthy man whose wife likes to play the field, and he likes to watch, and she gets involved with this couple who turn out to be something other than human, and but the way that because I try to do it very subtly. I like to think of myself as subtle, and dropping hints that all is not kosher with those two. And that's kind of a cautionary tale, kind of a almost an EC Comics, the weed of crime bears bitter fruit, that you shouldn't get involved with polyamory because maybe horrible things will happen, which isn't something I necessarily believe, but it makes a good hook. It makes a good, because eventually it gets to the point where this guy can't really back out without causing a scandal, and because he's wealthy and he's high, in the public eye, that cuts off some of the options for dealing with the situation, because he has to think about his reputation, and he has to, can't get out that, I like to watch my wife screwing other people. But yeah, I'd say they were probably my favorite antagonists.
Okay. So speaking of characters, it sounds like you did a lot of horrible things to yours. So if they ever met you in a back alley and they knew who you were, how do you see that interaction playing out?
Well, hopefully I will get my fantasy characters to form a ring around me to keep the science fiction characters away from me.
Okay.
And that's something I noticed when I was writing the introduction to my fantasy collection, is that I'm a lot nicer to them. Um, there are several fantasy stories that I have read or that I've written that actually have a happy ending. That they lived happily ever after, and a couple of others that at least they got away with their lives. So, but then when I think about it, if it's taking the story as a whole, the ones that I really mess with don't survive, so I don't have to worry about them. You know, it depends on at what point in the story the character comes to get me.
Okay. So since we've talked a little bit about your characters from this collection to give people just a taste of what they can expect, do you have a favorite character archetype?
uh, well, once again, it goes back to the same. I feel like I keep saying the same thing over and over again in different ways, but it's the working Joe. It's the guy that rises to the occasion, and that comes from um, old fairy tales, because we live in a world that is so different than the one that the fairy tales were originally told and written in. Um, we tend to think of wood choppers and shepherds as exotic characters, but they weren't to the people that the stories were intended for. They were just working Joes. They're the equivalent of truck drivers and uh, so yeah, it's the miller's son. It's the poor wood chopper who's out in the woods, and he encounters the big bad wolf or the wicked witch or whatever. So yeah, that would be my standard character. I just updated for the 21st century.
So for this collection, you mentioned that this was set in sort of the modern world with a twist. Um, are are any of them you think going to link together? Obviously, you said no as of now, but do you see doing that in the future, where you link some of your short content together and potentially characters interact with each other down the road? This is just idle curiosity, since the question didn't apply.
Well, sort of. As a matter of fact, a couple of my stories, one of them is called We Pass from View, and links to my series of novels, in that um, the the character in the short story is making a movie of a book written by the character's father from the novel. Um, in general, though, they tend to be uh, over. You know, it's like, I don't want Pete Ferris from the Blacklight Ballet. I don't want to bring him into another story. I feel like he's suffered enough.
Yeah.
Uh, and then of course, some of them are completely different. I've got an alternate history story in there, The Summer of Love, that basically a man goes back in time and kills Hitler and comes back to the present and find out that he's made things worse. Um, uh,
Time travel paradoxes can be fun.
I've written two time travel stories now. That's one of them. The other one is in Endless Summer, and and I enjoy it. I enjoy it. One of these novels that literally changed my life was Tim Powers' The Anubis Gates. Once I discovered Tim Powers, I was like, wow, this opens up whole worlds. And that's a time travel novel. Um,
So, any plans to take some of these short content stories and turn them into something larger?
no, absolutely not. I that's you touched a nerve there, but so many writers end up taking great short stories and making them into mediocre novels. And here's something else that I'm going to be in the blasphemous corner here, but Ender's Game. Ender's Game was a great short story, a classic short story, turned into a mediocre novel. And people are like, oh, but the novel's so good. But have you read the original short story? Can you find a copy of Unaccompanied Sonata, which is Orson Scott Card's first short fiction collection, and read that? And Larry Niven did that with he had a number of good short stories that he expanded into mediocre novels. And it's not that novels are bad. Novels, it's a perfectly legitimate art form, but the thing is that it doesn't translate. It doesn't. A short story should be short, kind of by definition, and it should be built around a single conceit, not always a single character, but a small group of characters, and it's a different sort of thing. It's a different, and I can't think off the top of my head of any fiction that was originally written as a short story and was expanded into a novel, and actually the novel gave more than the original short story. Generally speaking, it's the same thing, only longer, only stretched out. Like there's my dog. Dog and the cat are fighting. Anyway, and I realize that's an unpopular opinion, but and I could be wrong. And I'm perfectly willing to admit if somebody comes up with an example of a short story that became a good novel, I'm willing to consider. It's just thinking about it, I can't think of any off the top of my head.
What about short stories that are braided into a novel? Those meet your acceptable standards because they're not really changing much.
Well,
they're almost sequential.
Right. And I did that with Bad Dreams and Broken Hearts. Is that each of the stories is an individual story, but there is an overarching storyline that they tie together at the end, and that's cool. And that's that's what basically the Sherlock Holmes stories. You can follow along the character. Cannot think of the author. Tales of the City. Somerset Maugham. My
Peanut Gallery has spoken.
Yes, my roommate said. Anyway, that were originally published as short stories in San Francisco newspaper, I think. But it's a same group of characters, and the stories weave together, and so yeah, no, I think that's perfectly acceptable. It's just these particular, and I think part of that is horror as a genre is that it doesn't tend to do well with continuing characters.
It's almost like you need to know that there's a risk of death, and if the character is continuing,
Exactly.
the stakes are gone.
Right. And it's like Kolchak, the Night Stalker, which is one of my influences. I should have, when you were asking about early influences, thought it was the greatest thing in the world when I was in 6th grade. But it got silly after a while because you knew, because of the format of the TV show, that there's only so bad things that can happen, none of the continuing characters were going to die, or okay. Maupin is the author's name of Tales of the City. She's looking it up. Armistead Maupin. Anyway, There have been some, most of them in the paranormal detective genre, some continuing horror characters, but generally speaking, okay, you run into a werewolf once, but that's kind of a once in a lifetime event. When you run into a vampire the next year, there's something, it's just lacks its punch. Um, Horror is supposed to be shocking, and if it happens every week, it's not shocking anymore.
Okay. So you prefer to keep your short fiction short and not to change it enough to make it long fiction. Do you ever think about writing sequels for some of your short stories, assuming the guy's alive still and functioning?
I do have some continuing, like I said, the detective in Bad Dreams and Broken Hearts, and even after I finished that book, I've written other stories about him. Um, I've got some fantasy settings that are the same. They're not direct sequels, but they're set in the same world, which I never really got a name for. Um, but but uh, so yeah, I do, and sometimes a world is someplace you want to visit more than once. Um,
So when you write, do you consider the world almost as much of a character as the protagonist and the antagonist?
oh, absolutely, yes.
So
Um,
that would be something you could revisit as a theme or as just in general. You could go back to that same
yeah,
place with different people.
yeah. Although a lot of my short stories are also kind of um, thought experiments, and um, what if the world was changed in this particular way or that particular way, or you know um and those, a lot of times, once I've explored it, I don't have anything else to say. Which is a terrible, terrible curse for a writer, is that I can't write unless I've actually got something to say. um and um and so, and that's part of why I think my output is so low, because I'm creating a new universe every 10,000 words, which, when you've got
Yeah.
when you've got an epic fantasy or science fiction series, all your groundwork carries over. You get this. You don't have to go back and figure out, well, what's this, what's that. You've already got it figured out, and but then, of course, that's also a straitjacket. And I found that out when I was writing my series of novels, is that I wasn't free to improvise, because after a while it's like, oh, I have to be consistent with this, I have to be consistent with that, and I'm terrible with consistency. Maybe that's my secret, is that I like being able to start from scratch, and because otherwise I'll want to revise and rewrite, and it's like, no, we're done, we'll get a brand new blank sheet of paper, start from scratch all over again, and don't have to worry about what happened before, don't have to worry about remembering anybody's name, or you know uh, I tend to
Okay.
use the same names. Actually, I realized once that I had two different characters in two different stories who were named Butch Norton, so I had to change one of them. um
So your short stories, or at least some of them, have aliens and or fantastical creatures in them. So when you go about creating them, do you let nature inspire you? Are you inspired by folklore, nightmares? Like, where do you draw your inspiration when you're creating these creatures?
um I have no, all over the place. I am all over the place. I do a lot of stuff from music. Um, There
That's a new
are
one. Go on.
there are characters that I call Norns, aliens. Well, alien is as good a word as any, in Bad Dreams and Broken Hearts. That basically the whole concept of the species came from a line from Shriekback's song Nemesis. That is, we drink the elixirs that we refine from the juices of the dying. And so I developed a species that survived, that did their magical focus from draining fluids from human beings as they died.
Soylent Green is people.
Yeah. It's like, it depends on what function they have in the story. In my short story Milk, Bread and Eggs, I have an alien invasion, and well, not invasion, they're visiting, they're not actually invading, and I just have placeholder aliens. They're these silver eggs that float in the air. I have no idea what's inside the egg, or what they like, or where they're from, because none of that's relevant to the story. They just, I needed aliens, and so it's like, boom, aliens. In one of the stories in Atlas, called The Lord of Slow Candles, there's a woman, she's a bag lady, but there's a reason for it. And she basically is this paladin who is fighting off things that nobody other than her can see. And everybody thinks she's crazy because she's interacting with things that nobody else can see. And I went to as bizarre as I could for these things. I've got things called fingerers and eyeball butterers and carpet lurks and just, but I don't flesh any of these things out except for the grooves, which I explain what those are, and tanglers, and I just supply the names and let the reader figure out what the hell the things actually are. I try not to explain anything that isn't directly associated with the story. And the example I like to use is if somebody is, if you open a story with somebody being chased through a parking structure by giant scorpions, I don't want the reader thinking, gee, I wonder where these scorpions came from, or, I wonder what building this parking structure goes to. What I want the reader to be thinking is, does he get away, or do they eat him? And that's another thing that short fiction does, is it forces you to focus on what's important. And so many people I see all the time in writers groups where they're saying, oh, I've got this book and it's only 80,000 words and I need to come up with another 50,000 words. What can I put in? And it's like, if you're putting stuff in to make word count, then it's almost certainly not going to be something I want to read. Stick to the basics, stick to what, I talk about Joe and his sandwich, that my formula is, there's this guy named Joe, and this Joe is hungry and he wants to get a sandwich, and something horrible happens. There's a werewolf between him and his sandwich. And that's what you want. You want to know, does Joe defeat the werewolf and get his sandwich or not? I like to say that the basic formula is that you've got a relatable character who has got a reasonable goal, something that, he deserves to have, and some completely unreasonable obstacle shows up between him and it. Um, I forgot what the question was.
No, you answered it. So you talked about you've got some time travel stories. Did you ever play with parallel universes? They often go hand in hand. So
They often do, and that's what the Summer of Love in Atlas of Bad Roads is that it opens in the alternate world. It opens in an America that is basically under the heel of a one world government, one world Soviet government, and the main character is a prison guard in a concentration camp in Nevada, and so that's all he knows. He doesn't, that's the world that was created when the other character went back in time and killed Hitler, but um, but he's not aware of what our world was, and so yeah, because everything changes. Uh, and I do have some. I wouldn't really go so far as to say alternate history because that involves a whole lot more work than I'm willing to do. Uh, but worlds. What if this was different? What if there were local gods who controlled how things operate? What if magic was real? What if and every story is really an alternate reality in some kind of way. Even the most mundane thing, you're going to find, you know, people, places, and things that don't exist in the real world. And maybe they're things that could exist in the real world, but they don't. And at that point, you have created an alternate reality. It's just not one that's very different than our current one.
okay. So as we wrap this up, you've got this Kickstarter, which is what we've been talking about, some of the content that's in it, and just our mutual love of short fiction. It's currently funded and it sits at like 2,700. So what stretch goals do you have that you're hoping that people are able to unlock? Because we'll obviously link the Kickstarter in the show notes, but which one are you hoping for the most?
Well, we've got keychains, the little bottle opener keychains, souvenirs, the kind of souvenirs that you pick up that from various different locations in the stories, and I really want a set of those. So, and I think that's $4,000, but that's what I'd like to. That's what I'd like to unlock.
So I'm looking at the website, and I realize you've got a lot going on. So $4,000 is the business cards, and then $8,000 is
Yes,
the souvenir keychains.
right.
Does look neat. I certainly have a collection of those in my junk, a drawer of many junk things that one of these days I promise I'm going to go through and clean out. We all have one of those, and it's always in our kitchen for some reason.
Well, I love that kind of thing. I love tchotchkes from fictional worlds. I just you don't see that kind of thing very often. But even it's like I've got a T-shirt from the Ghost Facers from the Supernatural TV show. That kind of stuff. I just it's probably the geekiest thing about me.
Okay. So as we wrap this up, was there anything we didn't ask you about this Kickstarter that you wanted to tell us before we move on?
Well, I think I mentioned, but I do want to put on say it again, is that I've included poetry. There are 16 stories, there are 16 poems, and the poems aren't directly tied to the stories, but I tried to match tone anyway. But I think poetry is sadly neglected, And when I say poetry, I mean formal poetry. I mean stuff that rhymes, that has an actual metrical scheme to it. Um, and I try to say that as often and as loud as possible, that if you want to write good fiction, write good poetry. Just or write bad poetry. Just learn to write it, because it teaches an economy of style. It teaches a feel for the rhythm of language and that's the main reason I included the poetry. Actually, was so that people could see the connection between poetry and fiction. So,
Okay, and we ask this question every time. So this is horror, and so sometimes horror can be a little much for some readers. So what age range would you say your collection is suitable for? If you were going to give an age, if a parent's saying, "Is this suitable for my kid?"
no, it is not for your kid. No, definitely adult. 18 and up, 21 and up. I have bizarre sex. I have violence. I have adult themes all over the place. So this is definitely an adults only collection.
Okay, and before we,
not all of my stuff is, but this particular collection is.
that's fair. So before we let you go, dear listener and viewer, we will remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book, so do your part. And if you buy this on the Kickstarter, when this goes out on Amazon at however long after launch day, be sure to mosey on over and leave a review. He would greatly appreciate it. They do really help readers determine what books to get. So, Misha, before we let you go, can you tell listeners how to find you?
I'm right here. Best way to is Twitter, which is just Misha Burnett, or Cinnamon Bun Misha Burnett. I also have a WordPress blog that I don't update nearly enough. That is Misha Burnett WordPress/MishaBurnett.com. I'm on MeWe, same name. Basically, I just search for my name. I've never been good at working out screen names or pseudonyms, so I just use my real name everywhere, which probably is going to make me easy to cancel one of these days. But I'm willing to take that risk. But Twitter has got links to everything else, so
Okay.
that's kind of what I use as my anchor social media. That if you find me on Twitter, then that will have links to my WordPress and everything else.
Okay. So as usual, dear listener, the links will be in the show notes. He's got all of them. You can find us on our Twitter account at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email the show at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. You can join us on Facebook, where all the shenanigans happen, at facebook.com/groups/a Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, /groups/a Blasters and Blades podcast. You can find us on our website at anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades. Again, blasters-and-blades on anchor.fm. You can also support the show there for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. Or you can support the show more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep Doc Cisca and Nick Garber duly intoxicated. They will drink until their liver surrenders. And if they were here, they would tell you mama didn't raise no quitters. But thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, stumbled over that one today. I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom.